right, we're back with another episode of Permission Granted Podcast. I'm Kasia Rachfall, and I'm here with my amazing sidekick and good friend, Eva Ponce. We're going to talk about fathers today.
Yes, it's funny because we're in the month of June and we celebrate Father's Day here in the States, and I think you guys do too in Canada. And our last episode that we did it on Mother's Day, based on the fact that how motherhood and our adult teenage children, how that's a different dynamic that we don't really talk about. I don't hear many people talk about the dynamics of that relationship. And after wrapping up that episode, we were like, but there's also a huge dynamic with fathers and their adult children and their teenage children. And it's almost like an unspoken language that they have, right? Like you see that dynamic with your husband and your son, where it's almost like, I guess maybe because as women, we're more emotional, so we feel the need to want to communicate more, where with them, it just doesn't seem like that's the case. Like, how do you perceive that in your home?
It's interesting. My husband, both my husband and my son aren't really the man's man type of boys. Like they're both quite emotionally intelligent, which I'm grateful for. And even my son will tell you, like, in this house we feel stuff. Like that's, he tells his friends.
Good. Yeah.
So I think because of that, they're I don't know how to explain it. Like the best way to explain it, I think, is to, my daughter and her dad have a very different dynamic than my son and his dad. And I don't know what that is, because of course, you love your kids the same, you treat them the same, you teach them the same. And yet the personality or their frequency or their energy plays such a big role in how they interact.
Yes.
And my husband does have a great relationship with his kids, and he's a great father, but the difference is, like, one almost seems like more formal, whereas the other one's like more informal, silly, sort of.
Yep.
Do you know what I mean? Like, it's hard to even put your finger on.
Yeah.
But the older my kids get, the more I sort of see it and witness it. Whereas when the kids were young, my husband, he actually stayed home with them. He was the one who took care of them the most when they were little, because I worked, and it just worked better that way for my mental state,
Yeah.
And he's always been such a great dad. So it's interesting dynamic to witness now.
And it's funny because I have two boys, so I haven't seen the dynamic of the difference between a boy and a girl. But with my boys, when they were younger, my husband is not one that he's very emotionally expressive. Like he's one that he's very reserved, and I think he shows his affection with humor. So whenever he can crack a joke with the boys or whatever, like that's how they grew up, and their silliness as boys. And now that they're older and adult conversations are coming up, you can kind of like sense the awkwardness that they have, because I guess as they get older, the wanting to communicate and the wanting to not disappoint, like from the children's perspective, to disappoint the dad, or even him disappointing the kids. So it's almost like they tap dance around the conversation with jokes and stuff like that. So it's funny to see how when they were little, how they reacted to like now as they're getting older, and watching my husband taking more time to process their changes, because they're not babies anymore. Like, we have a 26 and a 20-year-old. So like things are changing, and our upbringing was different from the boys. Like you can relate with your children. Like there's a lot of things that our kids went through from younger to, teenage to young adults that we never had to deal with, like the whole social media thing, a pandemic, like all of these things were never issues that we ever had to conversate or tap dance around as adults. And then now having that come to the forefront, and then having like trying to have like those hard conversations when you need to have them as parents with your children. It's funny because my husband was never one to be very conversational, and now he's finding himself to be in that place. And it's funny to see how he is processing that. And I'm like, if it's happening here, I'm like, this must just be how it is with a lot of fathers and their adult children.
I think so. And like what I found, we had our kids very young, and I remember we never even really talked about like, this is the type of parents we'll be. Like, it was just sort of, we're going to be parents, here we are, right? So we figured it out. We all grew up together with our kids. We had to, because we were, I was 22, my husband was 24, so young, right, for this day and age. And I remember the conversations we did have were kind of like, I don't want to be like that. I don't want to be that type of dad, or I don't want to do that as a mom. And so, I could see my husband like trying not to follow the footsteps of his father where he didn't like the way it was, and trying to figure out his own way. And I really, like, I have always respected that about him, and him always being open to, like, sometimes when things would sort of get squeezed, I'd be like, your dad used to do that, or your dad does that. And he'd be like, oh, thank you for telling me, because now I can change.
Yeah.
So and it still is that way. We're still obviously all growing up together, even though technically I'm an adult.
But I mean, we're still experiencing life, and the same thing, like, that was one thing when my husband and I got together, because we're a blended family. So him and I came from previous relationships with, separate children. Like, our older son was from his relationship, and my younger son was from my previous relationships. And when we came into this blended situation, our kids were young. They were like 2 and maybe 8. So we really made a commitment to ourselves and our children that we would do by them as best as we could, and kind of course correct things that didn't go right with us and our parents, and to no fault of their own. Like, our parents separately did the best that they could with the circumstances that they were in, with the resources that they had available. But we noticed that if we had the opportunity to do that or better, we were going to make ourselves committed to doing that for our children. Like, when it came to just a simple conversation of like college, like, we didn't, like, that was not a conversation that was on the table when we grew up. Like, it was just a thing that, well, get a great job, make sure you have a pension, pack your lunch, because you can't afford to buy lunch. Like, that was the conversation we had. Like, with our children now, we're like, no, like, you have the opportunity to go to school. You have the opportunity to do the thing. Student loans will be student loans. They will be paid off. It's not anything you need to worry about. Like, when it came to their education, we did not put any exceptions to the standards of rules to say, well, you can only do but this much, or you can only go that far, or kind of like what we were saying in the conversations too, where kids get to a certain age, like, automatically they're at 18, and some parents are just putting the heel of their foot on the kid's ass, like, out the door, like, okay, goodbye. And we promised ourselves that we would not do that with our kids. Like, we would give them all the time in the world that they needed to do what they needed to do, because we wanted to set them up for a better, successful life than how we had to, I guess, get to those successes. So
there's definitely a lot more struggle, where you had to, like, and for me, like, I immigrated into Canada. I'm not born here, so there's that sort of story behind things, and watching my parents, having to do the things, even though they're very highly educated, both of them, not being able to have their education recognized here, and the values that I left home with about being like, you must be independent, you must get highly educated, you must this, that, and the other. And obviously I'm not the only one, you're not the only one. Like, I think all parents, and especially fathers, like, I think fathers have, like, men have we haven't had these conversations. Not all men are comfortable expressing emotion, or even going to that place where they feel comfortable feeling their stuff, or talking about the things that bother them, or asking for help. And
society has made it uncomfortable for them, because society has made it where boys don't cry. Like, get up. Like, oh, you fell, dust yourself off and keep moving. Someone hurt your feelings, we're not going to talk about
suck it up, be a guy, be a man,
suck it up. Don't be a girl. And that whole like playing both, like, we tried to do our best to let our kids know that although it was hard for my husband, because he grew up in that atmosphere, And obviously me being a girl, him being a guy, like the processes were different when we were growing up. But I remember with my own brother, like the whole conversation was like, you don't cry, you don't show emotion, like,
Yeah.
you're tough, you got to do this, like almost like this machismo, like this ego of masculinity. And it's hard because we're seeing like the aftermath of men not being able to process emotion.
Yeah.
And if they're not able to process emotion with their own dynamics as far as like their kids, like it's even that much more complicated for them to process emotions with adults, even with like us as their wife, for them to let us know how they're feeling. And for us, we're so emotional, like we let them know all the time how we're feeling.
Yeah.
Whether they want to hear it from us or not.
So true.
You know what I'm saying? So it's almost, and that's why I think a lot of the times people have this whole thing of failure of communication, because one side will hold or reserve for fear of getting rejected, or fear of not being heard, or fear of being criticized. And I think men have to live with that crutch because they've never been given the opportunity to process emotion.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a novel idea for many men to be like, you mean I can just feel this and get help with it and it'll resolve and it'll go away?
I can cry at a commercial and no one's gonna make fun of me.
Right. Yeah. I remember my brother, like he's younger than me, and even when he was little, he was quite cuddly and snuggly, and my mom would get flack all the time for letting him do that. And it's just like, what do you mean? He needs a cuddle from his mother. Like there's nothing wrong with that.
And yeah, we should never make our kids feel like it's wrong for them to process emotion, girls and boys, but boys more because it seems like it's so taboo for them not to. And it's a hard dynamic, because I think a mom, you can agree with this, a mom's relationship with a son is more nurturing, more endearing.
Yeah.
More emotionally vested, where a relationship with their father, not that they're not emotionally vested, but the dynamics of their relationship is totally different.
I know, and I find that so fascinating.
Yeah, it's just totally different. And it's almost like we were saying, like they have like their own bro code of sorts, like, and how they interact, and how they're silly with each other. And when they're having like those uncomfortable conversations, if they're had, really allowing themselves to fully be vested in the conversation and expressive in the conversation, and hold space for each other where it's just a conversation. It's not you're digging jabs at each other or criticizing each other. It's just conversation. And I think men with their adult children, boys especially, it's a hard even ground for them to get to a point that they can really have a great conversation without one feeling like butthurt.
Or like being talked at, or being like given advice or something.
And I'm seeing that, not only in my own home, but just other friends that we have that are in the same situation where they have adult children, and you can see the dynamic between the father and the son, where it's totally different from like the mother and the son, or the mother and the daughter, and even a relationship with the dad and their daughter, the dynamics, because you can see that. I've seen that with many of my friends, and the relationship that the daughters have with their fathers. Even that, even though it's more endearing and nurturing, even that has a taboo of awkwardness.
It can, for sure. Like how much emotion is okay, how much silly, not silliness, but like how much intimacy is okay within a family, right? With like the things you talk about, or the things that the topics that you talk about. And our biggest thing with Brian was always like, we don't want anything to be off the table. Whether it's money or sex, or like now this whole idea of different, the gender, or the I don't know what the politically correct term is for sexual orientation. That was always on the table, because I like some of these topics I'm so new to. I have been so new to throughout my life, and like I learned so much from my kids, and how they talk about things, and the language that they bring home. sometimes I'm like, okay, well, I don't know what that word means, because it's like you're using the word in a completely different context
Yeah.
than how I understand it.
And that's why I'm saying, like, we're still in a pattern of learning. Like, we will never stop learning. And we're in a place where we're nurturing and teaching our children. But like you said, our children have turned around and started teaching us things. And especially because these are things that we never had to deal with.
Yeah.
Like, these might have been situations that were going on behind the scenes, but no one ever talked about, because it was just wrong to talk about those things.
Yeah.
And that's sad. But I'm happy that we're getting to a place where the conversations are being put on the table, the conversations being heard, and the changes that need to be made are on their way to be made. I mean, we still have a long way to fucking go on a lot of topics, and we're not going to get into it because it's not a political platform by no means. But it's just, I just wanted to come in here and really like put that out there on how our fathers, our husbands, men in general, like their dynamics with their adult children and teenagers, and how it's totally different from how we have our relationships with our kids.
I think what works, like what I just sort of thinking about it in a big bird's eye view perspective, I think the difference, what allows my husband to have a growing relationship with our kids compared to like his own father and him, is my husband's willing to put down what he knows and learn something different, or be open to a different perspective. Whereas I find some of the dads from older generations are like, I'm the dad, this is how it is, end of story.
Yes. Old fashioned, and they're set in their ways. They don't want to know that there's a new way of doing it.
Yeah.
And that's hard, because again, we are raising our children right now in a time where we're all learning at the same time the trends and the changes that are globally happening in our world today, that we're all having to really engage and unlearn and relearn new ways of just coexisting with each other. So that puts like another layer of difficulty when it comes to conversation. But I'm glad we put that out here. If you guys are like jiving with this, or you can actually like agree with what we're talking about, or if there's anything that you want to drop in the comments and be like, yes, this is, I can see this with my husband and my kids or whatever, please feel free to put the comments below. And we just wanted to put it out there because we noticed that like that is just something that it's not talked about often enough. And I think,
and if you disagree, and if like how is it in your own family, or how have you noticed like your own dynamic from your own father, if you are a parent, even if you're not a parent, you know, you probably have friends who are parents, or you know, you've seen parents who parent their kids different ways, and I would love to invite men to the conversation, especially like how do they feel about it, what's inside them that wants to come out, and do they feel safe, you know, being themselves, learning who they are at the core, and coming to the table as fathers from that place of truth. Like my brother definitely is. My brother's a great dad. He's very emotionally intelligent, very open in that way, and nurturing, and I really respect that. You know, he's always beaten to the beat of his own drum, and I would love more men to do that, right? So I want you guys to come to the table and have these conversations, whether it's through comments with us or in your own lives. Permission granted.
Yes, permission granted to have this conversation at the table, and permission granted to even tell us, like I was just thinking, the dynamics of, you know, dads and their adult children and younger teenagers, but even the dynamics of moms and their daughters. Like that might be something, like it's not cookie cutter in those relationships either. Sometimes those are harder relationships to have than the father and the son. So if you want to share any of those stories, or permission granted to have those conversations too, because I think just us as a human species, conversation and really learning to be our authentic selves unapologetically with no filters, and being able to have a conversation where it's not accusatory or critical, or just a space to want to be heard. And like you mentioned before, where it's safe to really have that conversation, or those difficult conversations, or even if it's a fun, lighthearted conversation. Sometimes even those are hard to have, because you might be dealing with someone that is not that emotionally inviting for you to even jumpstart a conversation.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this can go in so many different directions, but we wanted to really start it based on dads with their children. Again, you want to share your stories, put them in the comments. If not, please, permission granted, like, make this a conversation around the table.
Yeah. Think
And
about
then,
it at least. Yeah.
Yeah. And then really, really ask yourself and tune in with yourself. How am I showing up to the table in conversation in relation to my kids?
Yeah.
And if you don't have any kids, it could be your nieces and nephews. It could be like, you know, how you engage with your godchildren, or any other type of, you know, relationship that you might have with other adult children. How are you allowing yourself to bring yourself authentically to the table and conversate and really hold space and respect mutually the conversation and the relationship when it comes to children?
Such important things to consider.
Yeah.
Like truly, not that we're not just paying lip service to this, you know.
No, like really an authentic connection of being in that safe space, of being heard, of being supported. Like you were saying now, because we're just going through this whole like dynamic of our kids really wrestling with so many things that we didn't, and having them being able to fully express themselves in a space that it's safe for them.
Yeah, because if you think about your own parents, like especially your father, right? Did you feel safe as a kid going to your father? And if you didn't, then how could you do it differently so that your kids feel safe coming to you?
That's perfect.
You know,
granted to do that.
Food for thought. Yeah. So yeah, and we'll
have all these permission slips, guys.
Exactly. Yes. So big topics, you know, we're not shying away from them because I'm so fascinated by human nature and how we work and how we think and how we can change, how even just a simple conversation can open up your world so much. And
that's it, the willingness to want to have the conversation and the willingness to really learn when to sit back and listen and support. A lot of times when people conversate, they're not necessarily looking for that feedback. They just want to be heard. And permission granted to do that. But guys, this is our last episode for this season. So we're wrapping this up in a beautiful bow because we're going to take our hiatus for the summer. And we will be back with more amazing content. We might be back with more frequency, but don't hold us to us because it's granted for us to show up in the way we want to show up.
Yes, permission granted. Totally. Yep. Yep. This is our playground, and we can play whenever we want, however we want. So we're grateful. We're grateful to all our listeners. How, you know, whether you hop on now or next season or whenever, we love to have these conversations knowing that someone out there needs to hear them.
Exactly. So we will be back in September. We will keep you guys posted on our debut for our next season, but have a great summer. Be safe, have those conversations, granted to do the things that you want to do and the way that you want to do them unapologetically, because you fucking can.
Exactly. And you're worthy of your life. You're worthy of love.
And you are enough exactly as you are.
Yeah.
We love you guys. Have a great summer. Be well, and we'll see you guys on the other side in September.